Well, so this week I had started to work on a sermon. Actually, I had chosen a section of scripture. I didn't know what I was going to speak on. And lo and behold, somebody had requested a topic. And as I went back and began to look at the passage I had chosen to speak on, the very topic that they wanted to be spoken on actually could be found within the topic, or the passage itself. And so I didn't have to even change the scripture I was looking at. If you will, go ahead and turn to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. The topic that was requested, and I can't remember how it was worded, but it dealt with relationships. And I think this is probably a good time to speak about that, because as we look at the things going on around us, specifically with the COVID-19, I think most of us would have to admit that relationships in general have been impacted in a number of ways. One, you've got people who really have become isolated because of what's going on. There are people that don't get to spend a lot of time with other people. And then you've got the opposite side, which is you've got people who are now confined really with a set group of people maybe within their house. So our relationships have been impacted in a number of ways, even here within the congregation. I mean, we're only getting to meet on Sunday morning. We normally are used to meeting on Sunday, having Bible study, spending time and discussing, and then worship, and then we meet again on Wednesday. And right now we're limited to just once a week. And for many people, that might be the majority of their interaction throughout the week. So what we're going to do today is spend a little bit of time looking at the gospel and its effect on relationships. You're in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, but let me give you a little background as to what's going on there. Paul actually here, as he writes to the church in Thessalonica, is discussing his conduct and his influence when he was among them there in Thessalonica. As you look at the congregation, we know it was established about 50 AD, and the congregation, I would say, is going to be very similar to the congregation that meets here. We know that it was comprised of people who had obeyed the gospel. We know that it is comprised of people who had relationships. And as those who were trying to live by the word, they should have had an understanding of the importance of relationships. Now, as Paul, being an apostle, shows up there in Thessalonica, we know that his goal was to go there simply and to proclaim the gospel. And as he begins to address the Thessalonians, he begins to recall his behavior and his role and his attitude and how it had an effectiveness on the spreading of the gospel. But he also goes back and he spends some time here in this passage talking about his relationship with others. Now, I think the majority of us understand it is very hard to teach somebody else the gospel if you don't have some type of a relationship with them. Not only that, it's very hard to have an appropriate relationship with others if you're not living according to the gospel. And so we're looking at a very basic concept, and I don't think most people would even preach on this topic from this passage. But I think you're going to notice as we go through here, the spreading of the gospel and the living faithful according to the gospel, it starts out with just the most basic of relationships. And so as we look at Paul's conduct, as we look at his influence here among the church in Thessalonica, it certainly serves as a role and a model for us as Christians. As Christians, part of what we do is to go around and to be a representative of the gospel. At least that's what we should be doing. Whether it's when we're at a store, whether it's when we're at our place of work, whether it's when we're in school, whether it's even when we're just in our houses around our family. That's what we're doing. We are representing the gospel. And as we think about that, you really have two options. You're either going to be effective at doing it, or you're going to be ineffective at doing it. And I think most of us probably know both people as far as examples that are either effective examples of Christians, or they're ineffective examples of Christians. But truly, we know for a fact this is seen in our everyday basic relationships. How many of you guys know somebody that you know right off the bat, let's say they're not a Christian, you know right off the bat that they're just a very worldly individual? Now let's bring it a little bit closer home. How many of you guys know Christians who aren't faithful? I mean, they don't come to worship, they treat people in a certain manner. The most basic concept of relationships is something that we're going to see being dealt with here in 1 Thessalonians. Let's start off with the most basic of how we interact because of our relationships and because of our understanding of the gospel, and that's this. We need to be confident in our living out and teaching of the gospel. 1 Thessalonians, let's look at verses 1 and 2. Paul writes to the church there, "For yourselves, brethren, know our entrance in unto you that it was not in vain. Let me pause for a minute. Have you ever felt like your life as a Christian is not really being as effective as it should be? I feel that way all the time. I feel like I do not reach enough people, even though I'm constantly trying to bring up spiritual issues. Paul makes it very clear here, it's not in vain. And he's actually going to show us this, and the proof is really in the pudding. He's writing to the church in Thessalonica, so we know for a fact it wasn't in vain. He goes on, but even after that we had suffered before, and were shamefully entreated, as ye know, at Philippi, we were bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God with much contention. All right, so let's start off as we begin to talk about our interaction in relationships with other people. One, we certainly have to be confident. We see that here in Paul's words where he says he is bold in our God. That boldness that we see from Paul caused him to speak when, as he says here, other people were contentious towards him. Now let me ask this, as we look at this and bring it down to a more personal level. How many of you guys have ever had someone be contentious towards you because you were a Christian? Maybe they didn't agree with the things that you believed. They didn't agree with your manner of living. Let me give you a quick example. How many of you have ever been ridiculed or picked on because you didn't engage in things, let's say, such as social drinking, going to bars? We could list a number of things. But the thing is certainly there are going to be those who are contentious towards us. Now, Paul here, he knew exactly what that was like, but Paul would have known how to deal with that. How do we deal with it today? Well, let me point something out as I talk about the fact that we can be bold and we have to have confidence. When we know the Word, we can have total confidence. What I mean is there are people oftentimes, they'll make a number of comments or statements regarding to spiritual things, and they might think that those things are accurate, and yet when you begin to think how we respond to those people, when we go back and we quote the Word, we can have total confidence. Let me give you just the most basic. Matter of fact, I heard it this week. I had a gentleman I was having a conversation with. He was asking me a question about baptism, and he said, but I know that she's already saved even though she's not been baptized. Does anybody have any verses popping into your mind yet? In my mind immediately I began to think Mark 16:16, right? He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not is damned. All right, I have total confidence in the fact that baptism is required, even though this gentleman, regarding a spiritual matter, has different claims. We could go over to 1 Peter 3:21. Most of you are familiar with that. The like figure whereunto even baptism doth also now save us. Remember again, he made the comment, I know she's already been saved even though she's not been baptized. I have total confidence that baptism is required because Jesus mentions that it's necessary. I have total confidence that it's required because 1 Peter 3:21 says that it's necessary. And so why would I bring that up? Well, you have a number of people today who will promote or they're involved in immoral relationships or they act immoral within their relationships. But we have the confidence based on the scriptures on how it is that we ought to interact with other people and how we ought to address those people. We're going to boil that down to a real simple statement a little bit later on here. What's the goal of everything that we do in our relationships? It's to get other people to become Christians or to help people who are already Christians be faithful Christians. That is the goal of every relationship, boiled down in its most simple state. So was Paul confident? Of course he was. Now he was an apostle and he spoke by inspiration, but the Christian today who has that same word can have the exact same confidence and boldness that Paul did. I want you to notice this. Paul says that he was bold in spite of his past treatment. In verse 2, he specifically says regarding what he had suffered before and that he was shamefully treated. Now you may be wondering, what is he referring to? Well, he mentions Philippi. Go ahead and turn on over to Acts chapter 16. I'm just going to give you a little synopsis of what's going on there. And remember, after this had taken place, we still see that Paul is bold. What's he referring to? Well, what happened in Philippi? You'll remember that in Philippi, the conversion account there is where Paul actually converted and baptized Lydia. Okay? And after that occurred, we see that there was a woman who was possessed with a spirit. She continues to follow around Paul and Silas and Luke. And listen to what she's saying as this spirit is speaking through her. The same followed Paul and us and cried, saying, These men are the servants of the Most High God, which show unto us the way of salvation. Now imagine Paul, He's going around trying to preach and teach the word. Imagine how disruptive it would be for this person to nonstop continue saying this, following him around everywhere he went. It'd be pretty hard to try to preach or teach a sermon when you've got somebody doing that. So Paul begins to get tired of this, and what does he do? Well, he orders this unclean spirit to leave. You'd think that would be a good thing. It actually led to a riot. Slip on down there to Acts 16, verse 19, and let's notice what happened. And what was Paul talking about when he brings this up to the Thessalonians? He says, and when her masters saw that the hope of their gains was gone, so they were using this woman possessed with a spirit to make money off of her, right? They caught Paul and Silas and drew them into the marketplace under the rulers and brought them into the magistrates, saying, these men, being Jews, do exceedingly trouble our city and teach customs which are not lawful for us to receive, neither to observe, being Romans. And the multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrates rent off their clothes and commanded to beat them. And when they had laid many stripes upon them, they cast them into prison, charging the jailer to keep them safely, who having received such a charge, thrust them into the inner prison and made their feet fast in the stocks. So what happened? Paul's out preaching and teaching the gospel. He actually does a good thing, and they get beat, and then they get thrown into prison. Now, I'm going to say for many people, they'd probably just quit right there, right? They would probably say, enough's enough, this isn't worth it, I'm not going to continue to go out and to deal with this kind of contention and fighting. But not Paul. Paul was confident and Paul was bold even after this took place. And we can look at a number of places where Paul had to deal with hardships and abuse, but he continued to be confident and bold in trying to convert people. He'd previously, he'd been seriously abused because of his teachings of Christ. We saw that it previously had happened a number of times because of his manner of life. Now again, ask yourself as we bring this to a personal level and we begin to think about the relationships around us, and I can actually think of people within this congregation that I know this has happened to. How many of you have had relationships affected because, one, of what it is that you believe based on the scriptures, or because of your manner of life and the things that you choose not to be involved in? I personally can think of people right now where I know that this has happened. There are a lot of people who might have to deal with these types of things that would allow themselves to become bitter. Let me say this, when that begins to happen, you know that we can really lose our effect on trying to guide people back to the truth within the scriptures. And I know that's hard to say, but many of us here are dealing with personal relationships with other people who do not believe what the scriptures teach, and I'll give some examples here. And maybe even ridicule that we do. And when we begin to get bitter, it really starts to affect the relationship. What did I say the goal of our relationship is for every single relationship we have? To convert someone to Christ or to help another faithful Christian maintain faithfulness, right? We're not very effective when we begin to get bitter. Now, Paul could have got bitter, but he didn't. He was still bold. He was still confident. And so we have to consider this as we begin to think about our relationships in our lives. We are going to have trials in trying to teach other people the gospel. We are going to have trials within the relationships that we have within our lives. And as we begin to break it down and bring it even closer to home, Jesus wants us to understand that many of the trials that we're going to deal with in our relationships are actually going to be in the very closest relationships that we have on this earth. Listen to Matthew 10, 35 through 38. Jesus says, "For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's foes shall be they of his own household. He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he that taketh not his cross and followeth after me is not worthy of me." What am I saying? As we strive to be faithful Christians in all of the relationships that we have, we know for a fact that our relationships are going to be affected. And yet again, the goal is for us in some way to impact people, to try to draw them to Christ if they're not yet Christians, or to help them to remain faithful if they are already Christians. What did Paul's confidence cause him to do? Notice there, go over to verse 3 here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. We're going to go all the way down to verse 12, verse by verse. It caused him to speak without deceit and guile. That used to be something that was really thought of as being important. People used to place a lot of focus on truth. 1 Thessalonians 2 verse 3, for our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile. Why was Paul speaking truth to them? He wanted the best for them. You guys ever noticed in relationships where people didn't really want to speak the truth, or they didn't really want to say what truth was? And oftentimes the reason is they didn't want to affect the relationship. They didn't want to upset somebody or hurt somebody. Paul could have gone in there and told them spiritually that they were just fine before they ever became Christians. He could have done that. But that's not what he did. What he did was he came in and he spoke to them without deceit, without guile, because he wanted what was best for them. As we began to think about speaking without deceit and guile, I want to break this down into really two different areas. Think about it this way, guys. False religion and false relationships or unrighteous relationships, they have to resort to deceit and guile to try to cover up the ugly nature of either one of those. False religion have to result back to deceit and guile to cover up what the truth really is. Unrighteous relationships always have to resort back to deceit and guile. Listen to what the psalmist writes in Psalms 101:7. He that worketh deceit shall not dwell within my house. He that telleth lies shall not tarry in my sight. You guys ever wondered again, why do people lie? It seems like it would be a really big question, but as I thought about this, I think the answer is pretty obvious, and it's boiled down to simply this. Whether a person is lying regarding religion or whether they lie regarding your relationship, it always boils down to selfish motivations. Always. There's no other reason for anyone to lie. That's not what Paul did. He never used deceit. He wasn't using guile. And yet we know that deceit and lies have become commonplace in both religion and relationships today. But here's the thing. Paul's letting us understand that Christians have enough confidence that we're going to tell the truth at all times, whether it makes someone upset, because the goal again is for every person to either learn how to become a Christian, or for every person who's already a Christian to become faithful or to stay faithful. Listen to Acts 20:20. Paul says, and how I kept nothing back that was profitable unto you, but have showed you and have taught you publicly and from house to house. So Paul was going around and he was teaching complete truth. Do you think that there were some of those people that were hearing this who maybe at first weren't offended by it? How would you like to be told that the faith that you're in is not the faith that will allow you to get to heaven? And for many of those people, let's say they were Gentiles who were living according to some other type of faith. You think some of them thought, so you're telling me that my parents they're not going to go to a place like heaven? That's the same thing people deal with today in our religious world when they're told that the religious group they're in doesn't result in salvation. It comes across just as impactful as what Paul was doing. But Paul was going house to house. He's giving them complete truth. Why? Well, complete truth leads to a complete understanding regarding the faith. It leads to a complete understanding regarding the church. It also leads to a complete understanding about how we're supposed to act within each of our relationships. Think for just a second of the people who are sitting here. You have people who are children, people who are fathers, people who are mothers, people who are husbands, and people who are wives. And in all of those, the Bible addresses how it is that we're to interact within those relationships, right? And yet we get the understanding of how to act in those relationships, again, based on complete truth, which again is what Paul was doing. Why could Paul speak with such confidence as he's giving complete truth? Well, the answer is because he wasn't looking to man for approval. He was looking to God for approval. Let's go to 1 Thessalonians 2, starting in verse 4. And remember, this is how we need to be thinking as we're interacting within our relationships. But as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God which trieth our hearts. For neither at any time used we flattering words, as ye know, nor a cloak of covetousness. God is witness. Paul says here in verse 5, his goal wasn't to please man. We don't need man's approval regarding what it is that we believe as far as worship. We don't need society's approval relating to what it is that we believe as far as relationships and what's acceptable within them. And again, I told you I was going to break this down earlier. We broke it down earlier when you see deceit and guile, it's really two different areas. You've got in religion, and then you have within relationships. It's the same thing when we begin to talk about not pleasing man. Again, we break it down into two different areas. Let's talk about religion first and see how how the world has impacted the focus on religion. You begin to look at, as a matter of fact, I saw it this week, you begin to look at religion and you will find that there are religious groups who are doing things not because they found them in the scriptures, but because it appeases society. Somebody had written an article and posted it on Facebook this week. I read the article, and about halfway through I thought it was total trash. And I was curious who would post it, so I looked at the author of it. I noticed he was a minister within the Churches of Christ, so I then went to look at the congregation. I clicked on the website, and then I noticed the name. And I began to look through the website, and I noticed that they sing a cappella for their morning worship, but now they have an instrumental service for their second worship. Well, why do I bring that up? Well, as I continued to go on, I then found on the next page that they have female ministers. I'm not going to go back and deal with all the different things I saw wrong on that within this supposed Churches of Christ, but how many of you guys look at the religious groups around us who have female ministers? Because the world thinks that we're not being equal within the religious realm if we don't have female ministers, and yet the problem is when you look at 1 Timothy 2:12, we learn that the women are not to be usurping authority and to teaching publicly, even though the world may promote that within the religious groups around us. As I continued to look through that website, I noticed they had children's worship. Guys, we're starting to see that in a lot of different religious groups. All of the community churches and groups around us are doing it. There are certain Churches of Christ who do not do it. People think that we're being, that we're just not being fair to the little ones by giving them their own worship time. Guys, go over and look at Ephesians 6:1 and Colossians 3:20, because when Paul addressed the children, they were in the assembling with their parents. We do not have authority to be splitting up the congregation into different units, and I'm not going to spend any more time on that, but I'm finding that prevalent and common even with supposed Churches of Christ. I know it's happening in all the denomination groups. The world is impacting religious groups based on what they think seems fair. We could go back and look at a number of other topics within religious groups where the world has changed compared to what the Bible teaches. I could just list a few more. How about the majority of groups now teaching faith-only salvation, right? There are a number of things that have come in and impacted religious groups. The world, they seem to want to please man, and so it's really addressed and changed many of the religious groups around us. But what about relationships? Well, the world again wants to please man. How have relationships been impacted? Much of it is coming through even the religious groups around us. I just began to list some stuff off here. Let's start with one of the big ones. I saw this numerous times today, or this week. How about the pollution of the marriage bond? We could address this in a number of areas. I think it was this week that Hallmark actually had the first married lesbian couples on the Hallmark channel? Homosexuality, that's being shoved down our throats. You've got religious groups who are perfectly fine with it. Society in general is even pushing this to the fact that homosexuality is okay. And yet the problem, guys, is when we begin to go over and look at Genesis 2:24, when we begin to look at Matthew 19:1 through 9, we learn that marriage is only between one man and one woman. But the religious world around us and even the world around us have polluted the marriage bond even more. We're talking about what we're seeing in the relationships around us. They've polluted it even more by allowing people to get divorced for reasons other than fornication. But again, that's not what you find in Matthew 19:1 through 9 or Matthew 5:32. And so relationships are being polluted around us. Religion has certainly been polluted around us, but relationships are being polluted. How many of you are seeing very common on TV and even religious groups around us who are perfectly fine with fornication among the unmarried? Again, that's not what the Bible teaches. They call it unrighteousness in Romans 1:29. And the problem in all of these things, when we begin to break it down, where someone has deviated in religion or there's a deviation in a relationship, all of it has boiled down to one problem, and that is their focus is not based on God. For many, because it's never been based on God. Listen to Matthew 6:33. And And as I read this, consider if everyone actually thought this, how relationships would be different. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Now, I'm not going to go into the context of the verse, but I'm using it for this. As Jesus talks about seeking the kingdom of God first. Guys, man in general today is focused on everything but the kingdom of God. And I get it that sometimes it's because of all the things around us in the world, things like our work schedules and things like extracurricular activities. But the problem is the majority of people are not focused on the kingdom of God. And that is seriously, seriously impacting relationships. Let's begin to break this down a little bit more as we continue on. Let's move on over here to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, starting in verse 6. And let's begin to talk about relationships and the need for compassion. 1 Thessalonians 2, starting in verse 6. Nor of men sought we glory, neither of you, nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, even as a nurse cherisheth her children. What's Paul showing us regarding relationships here, specifically with his interaction with the Thessalonians? And I think this goes along to our opening passage there in Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4, is that we need to concede our need for others. He talks here about a child needing a mother. Christians need each other. You know, unfortunately, because of the COVID-19 situation going on right now, we are getting very limited time with one another. Very limited time. To the point, like, we literally are only seeing each other on Sunday morning now. And for those who maybe don't have a lot of interaction, maybe they're not near their family, or maybe they don't even have a large pool of friends, their interaction with other people, specifically Christians, has very much dwindled. Guys, there is a growing trend where the majority, especially with the younger generations, the majority of younger people have very few friends. Much of it is because their only interaction is on social media. And that's becoming very commonplace. I watched a YouTube video the other day. It was very interesting. I watched it because it was a young lady, I think she's 21, and the video was, I'm 21 and I have no friends. And I watched the video, and it was really disheartening to listen to her. She said, I'm 21 years old and I have zero friends in my entire life. I have social interaction with people on Facebook in different ways through social media, but I don't have one friend in life. And there are a lot of people that we're around who have a very shallow pool of those that they're in contact with on a regular basis. Paul begins to give us the understanding here as he talks to the church there in Thessalonica that Christians need each other. As a matter of fact, specifically when we talk about Christians, listen to 1 Corinthians 12:20. He lets us understand that there is a need for us to belong, but the need to belong is not just for each of us individually, it's for us as a whole. 1 Corinthians 12, starting in verse 20, I'm going to read down to 22. He says, But now are they many members, yet but one body. And the eye cannot say unto the hand, I have no need of thee, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. Nay, much more, those members of the body which seem to be more feeble are necessary. Guys, the one body is made up of individual relationships, and we have relationships with each other within the body, but we also have relationships with those who are outside the body. Remember, I told you earlier, every relationship has the same goal. It's either to help someone become a Christian, or it's to help someone be continuing to stay a faithful Christian. It's always the same. And yet there's this need for us as individuals to be grouped up with other people. Guys, I think we actually see this when we go back. I'm going to go back to the very beginning of the Bible. We see this need rooted within man's very personal nature. We see it from the very beginning, that there's a need for us to belong. God planned it that way from the very beginning. Listen to Genesis 2:18. And the Lord God said, It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him an helpmeet for him. All right, so the deepest of these relationships from the very beginning of time is between the husband and the wife. We're talking about the marriage bond. And again, Genesis 2:24. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. All right, so the marriage bond from the very beginning was this idea of man and woman not being alone. We know that it is a special relationship between one man and one woman. But here's the thing, the most basic traits that make a marriage successful are actually the things we begin to be taught when we're extremely young, and those are the traits that we find that make every relationship we have in life successful. What are some of those basic traits? I didn't write them down. Let's just start to give some of them. Being truthful to people, treating people kindly and with respect, looking out for the needs of other people, helping those that maybe are at a time where they can't help themselves. We're going to, actually, Paul addresses a few more that we're going to look at. How about consoling people when they're struggling and they're down? How about exhorting people? Those are the things that we learn we should be learning as we're young children. Eventually we'll carry those into a marriage, which is the ultimate relationship we have, but those things that even make a successful marriage are the most basic principles we have in every single relationship we have. Guys, those things that I just began to mention, when we carry those out, those help people who are not yet Christians to possibly obey the gospel. It draws people to Christ through you. To teach the gospel, or for us to try to survive in this world, it really takes us having these close relationships. Paul shows us we have to cultivate deep relationships. Look at 1 Thessalonians 2:8. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were willing to have imparted unto you not the gospel of God only, notice this, but also our own souls, because ye were dear unto us. For us to try to go out and to teach the gospel to people who are not yet Christians, or for us to even try to survive in this cold-hearted world, requires us to have close, deep relationships with other people. How many of you guys want to go through this world all by yourself? How many of you have ever been alone by yourself for a time? It's a struggle. The church can really help alleviate that for many people who don't have a lot of friends or close family. But all of us understand the impact and the necessity of these types of relationships in our lives. And Paul says you need to cultivate these deep relationships, right? Good marriages require continuous cultivation. Our other relationships that we have in general, good friendships, they require cultivation. Now, when we begin to use that word cultivation, what comes to mind when you begin to think about cultivating things? Usually the first thing that comes to mind is the idea of seeds, right? You cultivate seeds to make them grow. As I began to think about cultivating relationships, and then I began to think about what it is that we cultivate in a physical sense, I began to think about seeds. That ought to make you immediately think about Luke 8:11. Now the parable is this: the seed is the Word of God. How do we cultivate relationships? We cultivate relationships through the Word of God. This truth that we're talking about here is one of the secrets of how Paul established strong relationships. What were they based on? The preaching and teaching of the Word. What were they based on for those who were already Christians? The preaching and the teaching of the Word to help them to maintain being faithful Christians. Then we see here that Paul was affectionately desirous of other people. What was he desirous of them to do? Well, if they weren't Christians yet, he wanted them to obey the gospel. If they were Christians, what was he affectionately desirous of them? To remain faithful. You guys see how simple every time, as you look at any relationship within the Bible, there's really two ultimate goals. Help them to become a Christian if they're not yet a Christian. Help them to be faithful if they already are. Over in 1 Thessalonians 2:7-8, Paul actually gives us the basis for every relationship. And so let's break it down, and we're going to break it down by looking really at just three words that he gives us. Verse 7, we see cherish, or caring for others. I think in every relationship, people need to know how much you care. Here's the thing though, some relationships we have are very deep relationships. Maybe we're talking about the relationship we have with our spouse. They ought to know that we care, right? Maybe the relationship we have with our children, they should know that we care. But then you might begin to think about relationships you have with others who are just acquaintances. Should they know that you care? Let me give you an example as I was thinking about this. I walk through the machines all the time, and I'm checking different things. I'm looking at paperwork. I had a lady call me over, and she said, is your church still meeting? I didn't tell her I don't have a church. The Lord has a church. But I said, yes, we are still meeting on Sunday. And she asked me if I would pray for her daughter and her daughter's boyfriend, who are heroin addicts. And he had just overdosed that, I think, the week before. Actually died right there in her bathroom, and they brought him back. I could have said, yeah, I'll pray for you, and I walked on. Do you think she would have got the impression that I even really cared if I would have done that? And even though I don't know her well, I do know her. I sat and talked with her for a while. What's a few minutes out of my day to get a greater understanding of what it is that they're going through? Maybe being able in some way to give advice or to help them. Whether it's an extremely close relationship or whether it's just an acquaintance that we know well enough to maybe talk about things, they need to know that we care, at least enough that we care about what it is that we're discussing at the time. They need to see that sincerity from us. That person, I hope, maybe one day will come to church here. They would never come to church if they didn't think I didn't care. And so Paul lets us know very quick in verse 7, one of the basics for relationships is cherishing or care. He then talks about in verse 8 about imparting themselves or sharing themselves. Paul shared his life with the Thessalonians. I wanted to know exactly how long he was there. I couldn't find a specific time frame as I began to look. It seems like many of the writers who have set out timelines think that he may have been there in Thessalonica for close to as long as a year. Paul shared his life with the Thessalonians. And so for us to share ourselves and have deep relationships means this. We truly have to get to know one another. There are people that are attending the same congregations and have attended the same congregations for years, and they don't really know anybody there. Have you guys ever known people like that? They showed up on Sunday, but you never really got to know them. You didn't really know anything more other than their name and that they came to church here. How many of you guys have acquaintances like that in life? People you work with, you know them, but you don't really know them. Paul, when he showed up to Thessalonica, think of it this way, he was a stranger at first, but Paul got to know them. He shared his life with the Thessalonians. It means we have to get to know each other. What are we talking about? We're not talking about superficial relationships. We're not talking about even superficial marriages where people simply seem to coexist. I work with some people who are like that. You begin to talk to them about their interactions in their lives, or they talk about their spouses, and there are times where I actually get the impression that they simply just live together. They don't have a deep relationship. We then learn another trait for relationships. In verse 8, he talks about loving dearly. How do we do that? Well, again, it varies. We love dearly certainly those we have deep relationships with, our spouses and our children and our really close friends. But how do you love dearly somebody that you really don't know all that well? Here's how you do it. In all those situations, whether a very close individual or whether they're not very close yet, you see the value of their soul. What I mean is again, it boils down to two things. One, if they're not yet a Christian, I see the value of their soul. They need to be a Christian. And if they are a Christian and maybe they're in error, I see the value of their soul. I need to help them to come back to being faithful. It's not always an easy process. But really, we learn in verse 7 and 8, Paul begins to show us the most basic traits that are necessary for deep, cultivating relationships. Next we learn, let's look at 1 Thessalonians 2:9. Part of this building and strengthening relationships is the need to be authentic. Notice what he says. For ye remember, brethren, our labor and travail, for laboring night and day, because we would not be chargeable unto any of you, we preached unto you the gospel of God. Paul's intent when he went there was to preach the gospel. That was his intent. But Paul didn't go there. I'm going to use some slang term. He didn't go there and mooch off people and have them take care of himself while he was just preaching the word. What we actually learned was Paul began to work as he lived among them. Why was he doing this? He was letting them understand he didn't want anything from them. He just wanted to come and he just wanted to preach the gospel. What he was doing was showing them that he was sincere and he was authentic. He wasn't there for any other reason. He proved that his motives were sincere. He just wanted to come and to be amongst them. He cared for their souls and he wanted to preach them the gospel. Again, that's the basis for every relationship, right? Sincerity, for us to be authentic around people. How many of you guys know somebody that when you begin to talk to them or deal with them, you get the feeling that they're not either being sincere or they're not being authentic? We'll address that here in a little bit more, but I think it happens quite often. I had a gentleman come in, I won't give much information, but I was talking to him, and I noticed that every time I would ask him a question, he would sit and think, and then he would answer, and it came across like a politician answering questions. It just didn't seem authentic. And when he left, I asked somebody else, I said, did he seem very calculated in his answers, and the guy said, I don't think he was being truthful. It didn't seem authentic. It didn't seem sincere. Guys, that happens sometimes. There are people sometimes who will put on a false front. That's not what Paul was doing here. He came to live amongst the Thessalonians, to preach them the gospel, and he didn't want anything from them other than to teach them. How did he also show that he was authentic? Well, let's look at verse 10. He lived a holy life. He wasn't like the other people around him. Notice verse 10. Ye are witnesses, and God also, how holy, just, and justly, and unblameably we behaved ourselves among you that believe. Paul says for all the Christians that were there, you saw how we lived. Paul makes it clear that he was clean in every aspect, whether you're talking about his morality, whether you're talking about his motivation or intent for being there, whether you're talking about his manners as he was amongst them. Paul's saying basically, the life that I lived here in Thessalonica when I was among you, I was an open book. You could see that I was being honest and sincere. He lived a holy life of it. He says they were witnesses of it. Well, what were they witnesses of? The very fact that he wasn't two-faced, that he wasn't a hypocrite. Let me pause for a minute. How many of you guys have ever dealt with that in a personal relationship? It would be the equivalent of me coming up here and preaching, and you guys find out that on the side I've been stealing from people, or that I go to the bar every night and I get drunk, right? Clearly I'm a hypocrite, and clearly I'm two-faced. Like I'm telling you guys to do one thing and I'm doing something else. Paul says that's not what you got when I was here. You saw how unblameable we were amongst you. Paul wasn't just preaching it, he was living it out. And so, imagine if in every relationship we have, this was the case, where we actually lived out what the Bible taught and what it is that many of us claim to believe. What would happen? Well, marriages would be strengthened. Relationships would be strengthened. The gospel would actually be lived out. What would be the result? There's a good possibility a lot more people would become Christians. He goes on and he lets us know that the necessity in relationships of exhortation and comfort. Listen to verse 11. As ye know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father doth his children. As Christians, we need to be willing to exhort when needed. Listen to this word exhort. The word there is parakaleo. It means to call near, to invite, to invoke, to beseech, to be of good comfort, right? That is necessary for both those who are already Christians. It's also necessary for those who aren't Christians. How many of you guys have ever dealt with somebody who really needed someone to encourage them? There are a lot of people in this life who need someone to come by and help pick them up. They need to be encouraged. Think again how much that impacts somebody when a Christian helps to pick them up and to encourage them. Oftentimes the way we encourage them is just by taking them back to the promises we find in the Scriptures. The promises made for us as Christians. We have to be willing to comfort when needed. The word here, paramutheomai, means to relate near, by implication to encourage or to console. I think every relationship that we can think about is strengthened when we can begin to relate to other people. Remember the example I gave earlier where the person began to ask me to pray for them, and I began to ask them, well, what's going on? And they began to tell me about it. How many of you guys could relate with a situation like that? Maybe you don't know someone who's ever been a heroin addict or an alcoholic. A lot of us do know people like that. We can begin to relate with it. But how many of you have had to deal with someone who was struggling because someone passed away? I know we've all dealt with that. We could begin to break these down into a number of areas, but it seems to me that almost everybody at some point deals with somebody who needs comforting, just as we find people who need someone to exhort them. We have to be willing to charge or implore when needed. Now, what's this word charge? The word here is martureo, means to implore or to bear record. What do we as Christians do? Well, we're employing the non-Christian, the need for them to become Christians. We implore those that are Christians to remain faithful Christians. That's one of the things we learn right there in 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 11. It directly impacts every relationship that we have. Now, as we begin to break this down, we really only got one verse left here that I'm going to look at today. And I told you, as you break down our relationships in life, it's always really two things. One, help the non-believer become a Christian. help the Christian remain a faithful Christian. Now let's look at verse 12. Because when we live out the gospel in our lives, that's exactly what we're going to do. We are going to affect every relationship. 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 12, that ye would walk worthy of God, who hath called you unto his kingdom and glory. Why do we walk worthy of God? And why do we impact people the way that Paul impacted people here in this passage? Well, again, the goal is always to help people who are not yet Christians become Christians, or to help people like the church in Thessalonica, to help those who are Christians remain faithful Christians. Some people are going to be impacted by us through our direct relationships. Some people are not. And there's not a whole lot we can do about that. But what we can do is try to strive to guide people to the church that's described in the Bible. How do you become a member of that church in the Bible? It's not complicated. We cover this every week because we don't know who's watching this online or who might be sitting here. But let's just break it down in the most simple sense. And I'm not going to give you my opinion. I don't want to say, I think the best way for you to do this is, and give you I think the best way for anyone watching this who wants to become a Christian is to open up your Bible. Look at the examples of the conversion accounts. Don't rely on any man to tell you how to become a Christian. Let the Bible show you. And in every conversion account, there was a minister or somebody going around and they were preaching and teaching the Word of God. That's how faith comes, Romans 10, verse 17. They were teaching them about Jesus, why he came, why he shed his blood, and the establishment of the church. You'll find why he shed his blood, Matthew 26:28, that was for the remission of sins. We'll find that Jesus established the church, Matthew 16, 18, and 19, which is the kingdom. That in a nutshell is the gospel. And so men were going around teaching that, just like Paul here in Thessalonica. They needed to believe in Jesus. Hebrews 11:6 and in John 8:24, Jesus says if you won't believe, you're going to die in your sins. And so people needed to hear the word. They needed to believe in Jesus, and they needed to understand the consequence of sin. And that's because Jesus told them they needed to repent of their sins, Luke 13:3 and 5. Nay, I tell you, except you repent, ye shall all likewise perish. They also needed to confess Christ, Romans 10:9 and 10. For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, but with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. Confession is made unto salvation. That's what we see with the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8. And then in every conversion account, we see that they were baptized, that's immersed in water, for the remission of sins. Jesus says you have to do it. Mark 16, 15, and 16. 1 Peter 3:21 says that it saves. And the reason that it can save is because it removes your sins. We see that baptism is for the remission of sins, Acts 2:38, and it allows you to have a clean conscience, Romans 6:3 and 4, through that death, burial, and resurrection in the water. And then as you continue to live your life, and as we all know here, we will sin again. And yet, as Christians, we can continue to repent of that, turn back and be faithful, and walk in the light, 1 John 1, verses 7 through 9. When you have obeyed the gospel as the scriptures declare, the Lord adds you to the church himself. Acts 2, verse 47. You don't join a church anywhere. The Lord knows when you've obeyed the gospel, and he adds you to the church. And then you're required to be faithful. That faithfulness, guys, will be seen in every single relationship you have. There's a way we can help you as we draw this to a close. You can come forward as we stand and we're led in a song of invitation.